The stage pulled in just after noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the shadows had nowhere to hide. Margot Vane was the last one off. She had learned, over the course of 3 days and more miles than she cared to count, that the last one off was usually the one who had been thinking the longest about what waited on the other side of the door. The other passengers had family. They had names being called out. They had someone already moving toward them before their feet touched the ground. Margot stepped down onto the packed earth of the station platform and stood very still. The town spread out before her in shades of amber and rust, low buildings shouldering up against one another along a main road that stretched in both directions before the land swallowed it whole. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and something faintly animal, the smell of a place that had been lived in hard and didn't apologize for it. A hawk turned slow circles overhead, unbothered by everything below. She set her bag down at her feet and looked around. No one was looking back. She had expected nerves. She had prepared for nerves, had rehearsed steadiness the way she rehearsed everything, quietly and alone, until the performance became indistinguishable from the real thing. What she had not prepared for was this particular feeling, the specific, airless quality of standing in a place where no one knew her name. In the town she had come from, her name had been the problem. Here, she was simply invisible. She was not sure yet which was worse. She waited. The station agent disappeared inside. The other passengers dispersed one by one into the arms of waiting people, into waiting wagons, into the ordinary unfolding of lives that had a shape she could recognize. The stage driver climbed back up and clucked the horses forward, and then even the stage was gone, rolling away down the road in a slow plume of red dust. The platform was empty. Margot picked up her bag. She set it down again. She looked at the road in both directions, and then she looked at the sky, which offered nothing useful. She calculated, in the way she had learned to calculate things since her father's death, what she had and what she did not have. She had enough money for 3 nights at whatever lodging this town offered, possibly 4 if she was careful. She had her medical kit, her mother's worn copy of a botanical reference she had read until the spine gave out, 2 dresses, and a set of practical skills that had never once helped her be invited anywhere. What she did not have was the man she had come to meet. His name had been in every letter, Stellan Hale. Careful handwriting, careful words, the kind of letters written by someone who had thought a long time about what to say and then said it plainly. He had described the ranch in terms that made it sound less like a property and more like a character in its own right. The way the light came in off the western ridge in the late afternoon, the sound the wind made through the grass in October, the way the land felt different underfoot than anything east of the mountains. He had not been poetic about it. He had been specific, which was better. She had written back in the same register. Specific. Honest. She had told him about the clinic, about the years of mixing tinctures and setting bones beside her father, about the particular satisfaction of knowing what was wrong and knowing how to fix it. She had not told him about the debt. She had not told him about the way the town had looked at her after her father died, like a problem they weren't sure who was responsible for solving. She had told him she was not looking to be saved. She was looking to be useful somewhere new. He had written back 2 weeks later, "Come in the spring. The land is kindest then." She had come. The land may well have been kind. The man was not there. The sun had moved a full hand's width across the sky before she heard boots on the platform behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She had developed, over years of managing a clinic waiting room full of people who ranged from frightened to furious, a habit of finishing her own thought before responding to an interruption. The thought she was finishing was this: she had two choices, and neither of them was going back. When she turned, she found a man she had never seen before, standing at the far end of the platform, one hand on a crate that had apparently just come off the supply wagon, the other hand loose at his side. He was tall in the way of men who have done physical work for a long time, not broad or deliberate about it, just built by repetition into something solid and unhurried. His hair was dark, threaded through at the temples with early gray. His face was the kind of face that didn't give much away, not because nothing was happening behind it, but because whatever was happening had learned to stay inside. He was looking at her, not the way men sometimes looked at women arriving alone in unfamiliar places, with assessment or opportunity. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they were not expecting and have not yet decided what to do about. "You waiting for someone?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't feel the need to fill space. Margot held his gaze. "I am." "How long have you been here?" She considered the position of the sun. 2 hours, near enough. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A barely perceptible change, like the moment before weather turns, when the air goes very still. He looked at her bag, then at her face, then at something just past her shoulder that wasn't there. "Who are you waiting for?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he had already begun to suspect the answer and did not want to be right. Margot said the name she had written in letters for 6 months. The name she had spoken aloud to herself on the stage when she was nervous and needed to remember why she had come. The name that had, apparently, become the wrong answer to the question. Weston Hale went very still. The crate sat forgotten beside him. The station agent's door was closed. Somewhere down the road, a horse shifted its weight and a bit clinked against its teeth, small and bright in the silence. "I'm his brother," he said finally. "Not, he's not coming. Not. There's been a mistake." Just that. A statement that was also the beginning of something he clearly did not know how to finish. Margot had spent enough years sitting across from people receiving bad news to know when someone was standing at the edge of it. She did not push. She waited. "Stellan is gone," West said. The words came out flat, not because he didn't feel them, but because feeling them fully, here in front of a stranger, was not something he was prepared to do. "There was an accident 3 weeks ago." He paused. "I sent a letter." "I had already left," Margot said. He nodded once. That, at least, he had already worked out. The wind moved through the space between them, carrying dust and the smell of the open land beyond the town's edge. Margot looked at him steadily. She was not going to cry. She had not known Stellan Hale except through letters, and the grief she felt was for something she had imagined rather than something she had held, which was a real grief, but a different one. What she felt most sharply, standing here, was the vertigo of a plan dissolving. "I can take you to stay somewhere in town tonight," West said. He was not looking at her directly. He was looking at a point somewhere near her left shoulder, the way a man looks when he is trying to be decent and doesn't quite know what decent looks like in this particular situation. "Tomorrow I can arrange for the stage back." "Back where?" Margot said. He finally looked at her. "I don't have somewhere to go back to," she said. It was not a plea. It was not an attempt to move him. It was simply a fact, stated the same way she might state a patient's temperature or the contents of a supply inventory. This is what is true. Here is what we are working with. West looked at her for a long moment. The hawk that had been circling overhead banked once and disappeared behind the roofline. A child ran past the far end of the platform chasing something small and fast. The ordinary afternoon continued all around them as if nothing of any consequence was happening. "I have a ranch," West said at last. 4 miles out. It's nothing. It's not what Stellan would have. He stopped, started again. "You can stay the night until we figure out what makes sense." It was not a warm offer. It was not unkind either. It was the offer of a man who had been raised to do the right thing, even when the right thing was inconvenient, and who did not entirely know what the right thing was but was trying to locate it. "All right," Margot said. She picked up her bag. He reached for it, a reflexive gesture, and she kept hold of it for a moment, not refusing, just calibrating. Then she let him take it. They walked to his wagon in silence. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, the road unwinding through grassland that rolled in long, slow waves toward the horizon. Margot sat on the bench with her hands in her lap and watched the land open up around them. It was different from what she knew. The scale of it was different. In the place she had come from, the land was something you moved through on your way to somewhere else. Out here, the land was the somewhere else. It didn't feel like background. It felt like presence. West drove the way he seemed to do everything, without excess. His hands on the reins were relaxed and sure, his eyes on the road ahead. He did not make conversation. She did not require it. She was, she thought, going to be very tired of her own company if she did not find something useful to do very soon. The ranch came into view on a long, gentle slope. A main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a fence line that disappeared into the distance. It was not grand. It was the kind of place built by someone who intended to last, which was a different thing than someone who intended to impress. The wood was weathered and solid. The yard was swept and practical. There were no flowers, no deliberate ornament, nothing that announced any desire to be looked at. It was exactly what Stellan had described, minus Stellan. West led her inside without ceremony. The house was clean in the way that single-occupancy houses are sometimes clean, not comfortable, but ordered, as if cleanliness was the one thing that remained manageable. Every surface was bare. Every chair returned to its exact place. There were no books left open, no forgotten cups, no evidence of the small, comfortable disorder that accumulates when a life is being lived in a place with any ease. It was a house that had stopped expecting anything. He took her down the hall to a room at the end. He opened the door and stood aside, and she stepped in. It was clearly not his room. There was a jacket hanging on the back of the door, a man's jacket, worn at the elbows. A pair of boots in the corner, not recently used. A modest dresser with a hairbrush on top. A man's hairbrush, but placed with a kind of deliberateness that suggested whoever had lived here was tidy by nature. A small desk along the window wall, and on the desk, in a shaft of afternoon light, a single envelope. Margot did not move toward it, but she saw it. And she saw her own name written on the front in handwriting she recognized from 6 months of letters. West saw her see it. He stepped into the room, picked the envelope up, and put it in the drawer of the desk. The drawer had a small lock on it. He turned the key, without looking at her. "I'll get you some water," he said, and left. Margot stood in the middle of the room that had been Stellan Hale's room and looked at the closed drawer. She was not the kind of woman who went through other people's things. She was also not the kind of woman who did not notice them. She set her bag down. She went to the window. The yard below was quiet. To the west, the land ran out flat and wide and then lifted into a low ridgeline, and the light was coming in from that direction now, low and amber, the way Stellan had described it in his first letter. He had been right about the light. She gave him that. She heard West come back into the house. She heard him moving in the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of a person doing a simple task. Water from a pitcher, a cup set down. Normal sounds in a too-quiet house. She stayed at the window a while longer and watched the light do what it did. Then she unpacked her bag. Dinner that evening was simple and mostly silent. West put food on the table and sat across from her, and they ate with the particular politeness of two people who are strangers and are aware of being strangers and have not yet decided what, if anything, to do about it. He did not ask her questions. She did not offer more than what was necessary. It was not uncomfortable exactly. It was careful. After, she washed the dishes because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because standing still had never been something she was good at. He went outside. She heard the barn door, the low voice he used with the horses, brief and businesslike. She dried the last cup and set it on the shelf. Then she did something she had not fully planned to do. She went back down the hall to Stellan's room, not to the drawer. She was not going to do that. She went to the window again, and she stood in the last of the light and tried to understand what shape her situation had. She had come a long way for a life that did not exist anymore. She could leave. West had offered the stage, and there were worse options than moving on to another town, finding work at a doctor's office or a small hospital, rebuilding again. She was not incapable of starting over. She had started over before, but she looked out at that ridgeline and she thought about the letters. Not what they had promised, what they had felt like, the particular quality of being read by someone who was paying attention. Even if what Stellan had been paying attention to was something he was building for someone else, she had not understood that yet. She was only at the edge of suspecting it. The feeling of being read carefully was not nothing. She was still at the window when the house went dark. She slept lightly, the way she always slept in unfamiliar places, alert to the sounds of a new building settling around her. The house had its own particular vocabulary, a board near the kitchen that voiced a low complaint under any weight, a window frame that breathed in the wind. She cataloged these sounds without trying to, the way she cataloged symptoms. At some point in the deep of the night, she heard West. He was not walking. He was still. The particular stillness of a man lying awake in the dark is different from any other kind of stillness, and she had learned to recognize it from years of sleeping lightly in the room next to her father's, listening for the difference between rest and the absence of it. West was not sleeping. She did not get up. It was not her place, not yet, possibly not ever. But she knew it, and she lay in the dark of Stellan's room and listened to the sound of a man carrying something he had not set down. She understood that sound. Morning came gray and cool, the light coming in sideways through the window. She dressed before it was fully light. She had never been a woman who waited for the day to begin without her. She found West already gone from the house, his coffee cup rinsed and turned upside down on the counter, his boots absent from the door. She put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. The barn doors were open. She could see movement inside, the economy of someone doing familiar work. She made enough coffee for 2 cups, left one on the counter, and took the other outside with her. She had been standing at the edge of the yard for only a few minutes when she heard it, a sound from the far end of the barn, quick and labored, wrong in the way that bodies make sounds when something is wrong. She set her cup on the fence post and moved toward it. Inside the barn, past the horses who turned to watch her with their large, steady eyes, past the smell of hay and leather and the particular dense warmth of animal bodies close together, she found one of the ranch hands, a boy of maybe 19, not older, on the ground near the far stall, his face flushed with fever and his eyes glassy, shaking with the concentrated effort of a body fighting something it did not have the strength to fight. The 2 men near him looked at her with the helplessness of people who are capable of a great many things, and this is not one of them. She knelt down. She did not ask if someone had already sent for a doctor. She could see from the temperature of his skin and the particular rapid quality of his breathing that there was not time for that question to be useful. She asked instead what she needed to know. How long, whether he had eaten, whether anyone had seen to the wound on his arm that was only now, as she pushed back his sleeve, revealing itself as the source of everything. She worked. This was the thing about her that people sometimes did not understand. She was not calm under pressure in the way of someone who didn't feel it. She felt it. She felt the urgency of the boy's body fighting the infection, the narrowness of the window, the inadequacy of what she had with her against what she needed. She felt all of it, and she set it aside the way you set a lamp aside to use both hands, and she worked. She was not aware of West arriving behind her until she needed something from her kit and turned to find him already holding it, having picked it up from where it had fallen when she knelt. He had not been asked. He had simply seen what was needed. She took it without comment and turned back to the boy. They worked like that for a time. Her directing, him providing, neither of them speaking more than was necessary. He was not trained. He did not pretend to be. What he was present, and that was more than she usually had. When it was over, when the fever had not broken but had been interrupted, when the wound had been cleaned and dressed, and the boy was sleeping in the particular collapsed way of a body that has been pulled back from the edge of something. Margot sat back on her heels and took a breath that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs for the first time in an hour. She became aware then that West was still there, standing in the wide barn doorway, morning light coming in past him, watching her. She stood and turned. "He'll need watching through the day," she said. "The fever will try to come back. If it spikes again before tonight, send someone to get me." West looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who showed much, but she had spent enough time studying faces to notice the things that didn't announce themselves. "I thought you were going back on the stage," he said. Margot looked at him steadily. She reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the efficiency of someone who does not have time for it to be in the way. "I'm still here," she said. The words were simple. They were also, she understood even as she said them, more complicated than they sounded. She was still here. She had not chosen to leave yet. She had not chosen to stay either. She was simply still present in this place, in this barn, in this moment, which was the only honest thing she could say. West held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, a small and careful acknowledgement, and stepped aside so she could walk past him out of the barn and into the morning. That night, long after supper, she lay awake again. This time, not because the house was unfamiliar, but because she was doing what she always did when the day got quiet enough to let her. She was thinking clearly. She thought about the letter in the drawer with its locked key. She thought about the way West had picked up her kit without being asked. She thought about the ridgeline going amber in the late light, exactly as described, and about the quality of being in a place where someone had paid enough attention to describe it well. She thought about what she had said at the clinic, to her father, to her father's patients, to herself. There is always something to work with. You assess what you have. You begin. Down the hall, West Hale was awake again. She knew it the same way she had known it the night before. The house had told her, in its quiet vocabulary of small sounds and deliberate silences, he was lying in the dark with something he had not set down, and he had been doing it for 3 weeks. And probably longer than that if she was reading the shape of him correctly. She did not get up, but she thought, in the honest dark of Stellan's room with the amber-edged land stretching out beyond the window, there is always something to work with. She was still here. That was enough to begin. In the morning, she came downstairs to find something she had not expected. West had left before first light, as he always did, but this time there was a difference in the kitchen. Her cup had been set out beside the pot, as it had been each morning since the second day, but beside it was a small bundle of dried herbs, rosemary, and something she didn't immediately recognize, tied with a piece of twine. No note, no explanation. It had simply appeared there beside her cup in the dark hours before she woke. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and held it to the light coming in from the east window. The herbs were from the kitchen garden. She could see where they had been cut recently, the stems still pale at the ends. She recognized the rosemary. The other one she had to go to her botanical reference to identify. Thyme. He had cut her rosemary and thyme before the sun came up and left them beside her cup. She set the bundle back on the counter with the care of someone handling something that meant more than it looked like it meant. She made her coffee. She stood at the window and looked out at the yard where West was already a figure in the distance, moving along the fence line with the unhurried purpose that seemed to be his natural state. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to work. She did not mention the herbs at dinner. Neither did he. But she had hung the bundle above the kitchen window, where the morning light would come through it, and she noticed, without appearing to notice, that he saw it there when he came in for the midday meal. He did not say anything. He sat down and ate. But for just a moment, something in his face had the quality of a man who has done a careful thing and found it received. That was the day she understood that Weston Hale communicated in actions the way other people communicated in words, and that if she was going to understand him, she would need to learn to read the language. Act 2. What stays and what doesn't. The boy's name was Clem, and by the third day, he was sitting up and asking for food, which Margot took as the best possible sign. She brought him broth first, then bread, then, when he looked at the bread with the particular expression of someone who had been promised a meal and handed a consolation, she brought him a proper plate and stood in the doorway of the small room off the barn where they'd moved him, watching him eat with the focused intensity of someone rediscovering something they'd taken for granted. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "I know. he said, with the breezy confidence of a 19-year-old who had already forgotten how close the thing had been. She let him have it. Youth was allowed its blind spots. She had been 19 once, and had believed, with total conviction, that she understood exactly how much danger she was in at any given moment. She had been wrong about that for years before she learned better. She walked back to the house in the late morning light with her kid under her arm and found West at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and a ledger open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. He had the look of a man who had been staring at numbers long enough that they had stopped meaning anything. "He's eating," she said. West nodded. "I heard him arguing with the plate." "Good sign." "Is it?" "In my experience, people who argue with their food aren't ready to stop having opinions." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It did not quite become a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one, and she filed it away the way she filed things that might be useful later. She poured herself coffee without asking. She had stopped asking after the first morning, when it had become clear that the kitchen operated on a logic of practical access rather than formal invitation. West had not commented on it. He had simply, on the second morning, set out a second cup beside the pot before she came in. Neither of them had mentioned that either. She sat down across from him with her coffee and looked at the ledger without appearing to look at it. Column work, numbers in two different hands, one tight and regular, one slightly looser, less patient with the line. She had kept her father's books for years. She knew the grammar of a ledger the way some people knew the grammar of a spoken language, not by studying it, but by living inside it long enough that the errors announced themselves. There was an error. Several, in fact. She could see them from where she was sitting. She drank her coffee and did not say anything about it. Not yet. She had not been here long enough. She did not have the standing to walk into a man's finances with observations, and she was aware, with the particular awareness that came from having been dismissed in exactly this way before, that an accurate observation delivered without standing was often received as an accusation. She would wait. She would watch. She would understand the shape of it before she opened her mouth. West closed the ledger and picked up his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup with an expression she was becoming familiar with. Not unfriendly, but assessing. The look of someone who was still in the process of determining what to make of her. "Clem says you didn't sleep the first night," he said. Clem was unconscious the first night. He says Harlan told him. Harlan apparently knows things. She looked at him steadily. "That I can believe." Harlan was the oldest of the ranch hands, a man of few words and long memory, who seemed to know everything that happened on this property without ever appearing to watch. West set his cup down. "Did you sleep?" She looked at him. It was a direct question, and he had asked it without the hedging that men sometimes put around questions they were not sure they were entitled to ask. She appreciated the directness, even if the question itself was more personal than their current footing probably warranted. "Some," she said, which was true. "Enough," which was also true by a reasonable definition of enough. He accepted this without pressing. He stood, took his cup to the counter, and picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "There's a fence line on the south side that needs checking. I'll be back before supper." He was. He always was, she was learning. Whatever else could be said about Weston Hale, he was a man who appeared when he said he would appear, which was not a small thing. The days settled into a shape. It was not a comfortable shape exactly. It had the quality of two people carefully circling a space they hadn't figured out how to share, being deliberate about where they put their feet, aware of edges they hadn't yet mapped. But it was a shape, and Margot had learned long ago that a shape, even an imperfect one, even one that required constant minor adjustment, was better than formlessness. She cooked because it needed doing, and because she was good at it, and because the kitchen, once she had spent an afternoon reorganizing it along principles that made actual sense, was a satisfying place to work. West ate without complaint and thanked her every time, which she noticed not because gratitude was extraordinary, but because it was consistent. And consistency, in her experience, was the more reliable indicator of character. She tended to Clem in the mornings. She explored the property in the afternoons, learning its vocabulary the way she had learned the houses, which fence lines were holding, and which were only managing, which of the 3 horses moved differently than they should, which direction the weather came from when it came. She did not ask permission for these walks. She did not announce them. She simply went, and when she came back, West did not ask where she had been. On the 4th day, she found the supply ledger in the drawer under the kitchen counter, different from the one she had seen West studying, this one purely domestic. And she spent an evening reorganizing it. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was simply doing what her hands wanted to do when they were idle, making order out of disorder. On the 5th day, West came in for supper and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. He stood there for a moment. She kept her back to him and stirred the pot on the stove. "You moved things," he said. "The cooking stores were in the wrong order. I put similar things together." Silence. "It's different. Does different bother you?" Another silence, shorter this time. "No." She heard him sit down. She heard him pick up the revised supply ledger, turn a few pages, set it back down. "The numbers are cleaner," he said. "They were never wrong. They were just harder to read than they needed to be." "Stellan kept that one," he said. She did turn around then. He was looking at the ledger on the table, not at her. His expression had the particular flatness of someone holding something in. "I can change it back," she said. "No." He picked up the ledger and returned it to the drawer. "It's fine." He sat down. "It's good, actually." She turned back to the stove and let the moment settle without pressing on it. The thing about grief, she had observed over years of sitting beside it, was that it did not arrive in straight lines. It came sideways, unexpectedly, through small openings that had nothing to do with the subject of the grief itself. A reorganized ledger. A moved chair. The particular way afternoon light came through a window that the dead person had once described in a letter. She had learned not to be surprised by this. She had learned, more importantly, not to comment on it when it happened. West was grieving in the way of men who had decided they were not allowed to, which made it quieter and sharper and longer than it needed to be. She did not say this. She simply kept cooking. What she had not expected, what she was aware of expecting less and less with each day that passed, was that Weston Hale was interesting. Not in the way of men who tried to be interesting, who deployed stories and opinions and carefully managed surfaces. He was interesting in the way of country that looks flat until you're in it. And then you realize it has 1,000 gradations of texture and depth that only revealed themselves with proximity and time. He had opinions that he held quietly and did not offer unless asked, but which, when they emerged, were considered and occasionally surprising. He was not sentimental, but he was not hard either. He was the product of a life that had required him to be practical about most things. And he was practical, But there was a layer underneath the practicality that she kept catching glimpses of and then losing again. She caught one such glimpse on a rainy afternoon in the second week. She had been in the kitchen working on something for Clem, who was well enough to be restless, but not well enough to go back to full work, when she heard a voice from the far end of the barn. Low, unhurried, entirely unlike the voice West used with people. She had learned by then to identify the barn as a place where he went when he needed to be somewhere the house wasn't, and she had been careful about that boundary. But the rain was coming in sideways, and she needed an herb that was drying in the barn, so she went. He was at the far stall, the one where Stellan's horse lived, a dark bay who had not, in the 2 weeks she had been here, allowed anyone to get particularly close. West's back was to the door. He was talking to the horse in a voice she had never heard him use, low and slow and entirely unself-conscious. The voice of someone who had learned that certain conversations were easier without witnesses. She could not make out the words. She did not try to. She got the herb from the drying rack by the door, moving quietly, and turned to leave. He heard her anyway. He went still. She felt the change in the room without turning around. She paused at the door, her back still to him. "He lets you near him," she said. "That's not nothing." A long pause. Took a month after Stellan died. "What changed?" Another pause. "I stopped trying." She nodded once, slowly, though he couldn't see it, and went back to the house through the rain. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The particular wisdom in it. The way some things that wouldn't come toward you when you pursued them would simply be there, one day, when you had stopped demanding they appear. She was thinking about this. Less about the horse, and more about everything else. When Reverend Aldous Price arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, she knew who he was before anyone told her. She had grown up around men of institutional authority, the kind who carried their confidence in their posture, who moved through space with the specific ease of people who had never been required to explain their presence anywhere. Price was not aggressive. He was not even, on the surface, unkind. He was simply, entirely, sure of himself, and that certainty extended to being sure about her. He arrived in a good coat on a well-kept horse and accepted the coffee she offered with the grace of a man accustomed to being offered coffee by women in houses he visited. He and West spoke for a while about things she was only half attending to: ranch business, community matters, the small machinery of a settled place. She sat at the kitchen table with her own coffee and her botanical reference and kept her eyes on the page. Then Price turned to her. "You've been here nearly 3 weeks, he said, pleasantly, as one might observe the weather. "I have," Margot said. "And you're finding it comfortable? Here?" She looked at him. She had sat across from men like Price before, men who asked questions in a particular register, warm and careful, that were not quite questions at all. "It's a good place," she said. "The land is what Stellan described." Something moved in Price's expression at the name. A small, careful adjustment, the look of a man recalibrating. Of course, a difficult situation for everyone. He paused. "I've been thinking about what might be best. For you particularly. A woman in your position." "My position?" Margot said. "Alone, in an unfamiliar place, with no formal—" "I beg your pardon," Margot said, still pleasantly. "But what position is that, exactly?" Price smiled the smile of a man who was being patient. "It's simply that there are certain understandings in a community like this. about how things are properly arranged. I'm sure you appreciate that." She looked at him with the expression she used when she was thinking clearly and did not want the person across from her to know how clearly she was thinking. "I appreciate a great many things," she said. "He said he would be in touch with West about certain matters." He finished his coffee. He left. West watched him ride out from the kitchen doorway, and then stood there for a moment longer than necessary. "What matters?" Margot asked. West turned. He was doing the thing with his jaw that she had come to recognize as the external trace of something happening inside that he had not yet decided to share. "He has thoughts," West said, "about what should happen next." "About me." "He means well." "I know," Margot said. "That's not the same as being right." West looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat and went back outside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard and tried to read the set of his shoulders, which she was getting better at. He had not told Price to mind his business. He had not defended her, not openly. But he had not agreed with the man either. And in the grammar of Weston Hale, silence was sometimes the most complicated thing he said. She needed to understand this better before she decided what to do with it. The understanding came, in part, from an unexpected direction. She had found the box of letters in the third week, not because she was looking for them, but because she was reorganizing the linen shelf in the hall, and the box was behind a folded blanket that was falling apart at one edge and needed mending. The box was small and plain and had no lock. She lifted the lid. Inside were her letters to Stellan. Every one of them, from the first cautious introduction to the last one she had written 4 days before she left, in which she had described what she was packing and allowed herself, for the first and only time, to use the word hopeful. He had kept them all. She sat down on the floor of the hallway, with the box in her lap, and looked at the stack of letters. They were organized in order, each one neatly folded, the envelopes slid open carefully, the way a person opens something they intend to keep. She had not known what to expect from Stellan Hale when she agreed to come. She had known he was careful and honest and paid attention. This confirmed what she had suspected. He had been paying a particular kind of attention. But as she sat with the box, a different thought arrived, quieter and stranger. She went back through Stellan's letters to her. She had brought them, always bringing things that might be useful. She read them again, there on the hallway floor, with the afternoon light going sideways through the window. He had described the ranch in loving detail. He had described the land, the seasons, the way particular chores felt in particular weather. He had described the community, Price, the general store, the woman who kept the post, the family 3 miles east with the children who sometimes came to fish in the creek. He had described everything with careful, specific attention. He had never once mentioned West, not in a single letter, not in passing, not as context, not as the answer to any practical question. She had assumed, vaguely, that he was simply private. But sitting on the hallway floor with 6 months of letters in her lap, she understood that the omission was not privacy. It was architecture. Stellan had built something deliberate in these letters, and he had left West out of the blueprint entirely. She did not understand why yet. But she put the letters away and sat for a while in the quiet of the hall and let the question take shape. She asked Harlan about it. She found him mending a gate on the east side of the property one afternoon, and she fell into step beside him in a way that suggested she was simply there for the walk and happened to have questions. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Long enough," Harlan said, which was exactly the kind of answer she had expected. Did you know Stellan well? Harlan glanced at her sideways. Knew him his whole life. And West? A pause. The gate hinge received careful attention. Knew him longer. She waited. They were different men, Harlan said finally. Stellan wanted things to happen. West waited for things to be right. He set down the hinge tool. Not always the same thing. Wanting and waiting. She thought about this. They weren't speaking, she said, before Stellan died. It was not a question. Harlan heard that. 3 years, he said. Near enough. What happened? Harlan looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how much to say to a woman he had known for 3 weeks. He appeared to decide that she had earned something, if not everything. Wasn't about land, he said. Wasn't about money. Was about a person. He picked up his tools. West stepped back. That's what he does. He steps back and lets things happen and tells himself that's the decent thing. He paused. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just easier than standing in the road. He walked away. She stood at the gate and looked out at the east pasture for a long time. That evening, she was at the kitchen table with the supply ledger. The real one. The one with the error she had been sitting with for 2 weeks. The error that had grown clearer and more deliberate the longer she looked at it. When she heard horses in the yard. She looked up through the window. A woman she had not seen before was dismounting at the post. She was perhaps a few years older than Margot, with fair hair and the particular economy of movement of someone who had grown up around horses. She was not dressed for a social call. She was carrying a small wooden box with both hands. West came out of the barn. He went very still when he saw her. They stood in the yard for a moment, the two of them, with something passing between them that Margot, watching from the window, could not name. It was not hostility. It was not entirely ease either. It was the specific quality of a history that had been put away and was now standing in the yard holding a wooden box. West said something. The woman said something back. Then they both looked at the house. Margot stepped back from the window, but she did not leave the kitchen. West brought the woman inside. Her name was Vera Lund. She said it herself, directly, the way of someone who was accustomed to saying difficult things without softening them first. She looked at Margot with an expression that Margot had not seen before and could not immediately catalog. Not jealousy, not assessment, but something stranger, a recognition of something she had expected without knowing she was expecting it. They sat. Margot made tea. Vera held the wooden box in her lap. She talked about Stellan in the way of someone who had done the primary work of grief and come out the other side of it into something quieter. She did not cry. She did not perform composure either. She was simply a woman who had loved a person and lost him and was still, imperfectly and daily, working out what that meant. Margot listened. West sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing. When the tea was finished, Vera stood to leave. She set the wooden box on the table. She looked at Margot with that same strange recognizing expression. He would have wanted you to have this, she said. Then she looked at West. Something in her look said, you know why she's here. You've known for longer than you've admitted. She left. Her horse's hooves diminished in the yard, and then there was only the sound of the wind and the small domestic sounds of the house around them. Margot looked at the wooden box. West looked at the wall. Who is she? Margot asked. She knew some of the answer. She wanted to hear his version. Stellan's wife, West said. Widow. She knew him well. Yes? A pause. The box sat between them on the table. Neither of them moved toward it. She looked at you like someone who has been waiting to give something back, Margot said. West said nothing. Was she someone to you? Margot asked. Directly. The way she asked things when she had decided that indirection was costing more than it was worth. Before Stellan. The silence that followed was the longest West had allowed himself in her presence. She did not try to fill it. She waited the way she had learned to wait, with her hands still and her attention full. It doesn't matter now, he said. It might, she said. I'm trying to understand the shape of things. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way he had looked at her on the platform, like something he had not expected and was still in the process of deciding what to do with. There was a time, he said, when it might have mattered. But I didn't say what I should have said. And then there wasn't a time anymore. Margot nodded slowly. She looked at the box. And Stellan didn't know. West looked at the wall again. No. So the 3 years were something else by then, he said. By the time they married, it was something else. I was angry. And then I was ashamed of being angry. And then it was just distance. The way things get when you let them get that way long enough. He stood up. He carried his cup to the counter. He stood there a moment with his back to her. He called to me, West said. That morning. I told you that. A pause. What I didn't tell you was that I knew what he wanted to say. I knew because he'd been working up to it for a week. I could see him working up to it. And He stopped. His hands were on the counter, not gripping, just resting. But she could see the stillness in them that was the stillness of a man holding himself carefully. I wasn't ready to hear it, so I found somewhere else to be. The kitchen held the weight of that. Margot did not say it wasn't your fault. She did not say he knew. She said, he called to you. After 3 years, he called to you first. West was quiet. That's not nothing either, she said. She picked up the wooden box and took it to her room. She did not open it that night. She set it on the desk in Stellan's room, beside the locked drawer, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them in the dark for a long time. She was beginning to understand the shape of things, not the shape she had come here expecting. Something different, more complicated, less clearly mapped, but a shape nevertheless. And she had never been able to leave a shape unexamined, which was either her greatest strength or the thing that had made her life considerably harder than it needed to be. The wind came up in the night, the way it did in this country, sudden and total, like a decision. It moved through the grass in long waves she couldn't see but could hear, and the house shifted and settled around it. And Margot lay in the dark and listened to everything the place was telling her. She was still here. That was not an accident anymore. In the days that followed Vera's visit, something in the texture of the house changed. It was not a dramatic change. Nothing about Weston Hale was dramatic. But it was real. He started leaving the kitchen lamp burning when he went out in the early mornings so she would not wake to darkness. He began returning from the barn on the north side of the house rather than the south, which added 3 minutes to his walk, but brought him past the kitchen window where she was usually working. And she noticed, though she gave no sign of noticing, that he always looked in. She made adjustments of her own. She began leaving a plate covered on the back of the stove when supper ran late and he hadn't come in. She reorganized the boot shelf by the door so his pair, always the largest, always the most worn, was at the front. Small things. The kind of things that accumulate, over time, into a life shared. One afternoon, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of leather and a needle, working on a strap that had come loose from one of the harnesses. He did not look up when she came in. She put the kettle on and sat across from him with her botanical reference, and they were together in the kitchen for 2 hours without either of them saying more than a dozen words, and it was comfortable. The particular comfort of a shared silence that doesn't need to justify itself. It was different from the silences of the first week, which had been careful. This one was easy. She had not expected easy to arrive so soon, and she was suspicious of it in the way she was suspicious of anything that presented itself as simple, because in her experience, simple things usually weren't. But she sat with her book and he worked his leather, and the afternoon went by and nothing complicated happened. And when the light shifted, she closed her reference and went to start supper, and he folded the repaired strap and set it on the shelf and went back outside. And it was exactly what it appeared to be. The community's attention, which she had felt from the first day as a kind of ambient pressure, did not abate. She heard things through Clem, who knew everything that happened within a 5-mile radius and had no particular talent for discretion, and through the occasional visit to the general store, where the woman who kept the post counter had a way of gathering information and redistributing it that Margot found both impressive and exhausting. People had opinions about her presence. Some of those opinions were kind. Others were the kind of opinions that people hold about situations they find irregular, which are often more about their own discomfort than about the situation itself. She did not find this surprising. She had lived her whole life being, in one way or another, slightly more than people were prepared for. She had made a kind of peace with it. What she had not made peace with was the way the weight of those opinions seemed to settle on West, not on her, but on him, the way weather settles on the highest ground. She could see it sometimes in the set of his shoulders when he came back from town. She never asked about it. It was not her place to ask, not yet, but she watched and she thought about it. And she added it to the accumulating picture she was building of a man who carried responsibility for everything in his orbit, and had been doing so alone for longer than he should have had to. She opened the wooden box on a Wednesday morning when the light was good. She had waited 4 days, not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because she had learned, through years of sitting beside things that were about to change, that the moment before a thing was known had its own particular value. Once you opened something, you could not unopen it. She had wanted to be ready. Inside the box was a folded piece of paper, a small river stone that had been worn smooth by water, and a length of faded ribbon, the kind used to tie correspondence. The stone and the ribbon she set aside. The paper she unfolded carefully, the way she unfolded anything that had been handled by someone else with care. It was Stellan's handwriting, the same careful, unhurried hand from 6 months of letters. But this was not a letter. It was the beginning of one, written and stopped, the last line trailing off mid-sentence the way thoughts do when something interrupts them and the interruption turns out to be permanent. She read it slowly. He had written about the ranch in the early part, the way he always did, grounding himself in the specific and physical before he moved to anything harder. He had written about the way the light changed in the afternoons, about Clem's ongoing argument with a particular fence post, about the dark bay horse who still wouldn't let anyone near. And then, toward the bottom of the page, his handwriting had shifted almost imperceptibly, not less careful, but more deliberate, as though he had decided to say something he had been working up to for some time. There is a thing I haven't told you about this place, he had written. I've been trying to find the right order to say it. The ranch is mine in name and in the work of it, but the backbone of this place, the thing that makes it hold when everything else is difficult, that's West. I don't say that often enough, and I haven't said it to you at all, which isn't fair to either of you. He doesn't know I'm writing this. He doesn't know I've written to you at all, or not the whole of it. I told him I was thinking about it, and he said..." The sentence ended there. Margot sat with the unfinished letter for a long time. The morning light moved across the floor in the slow way of days with no clouds. She could hear the sounds of the yard outside. Clem's voice, now fully restored to its usual commentary on everything, and the lower, more economical sounds of West doing the work that structured his days. She read the last complete line again. He doesn't know I've written to you at all, or not the whole of it. She thought about this. She thought about 6 months of letters that never mentioned a brother. She thought about what Harlan had said. West stepped back. That's what he does. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years in the same house as a silence he didn't know how to cross. She folded the letter and held it in her hands. Stellan had been building something. She could see the architecture of it now, the way you could see the structure of a building once you understood where the load-bearing walls were. He had written to her because he wanted someone for West, not for himself, or not only for himself, but the shape of what he'd built made more sense now. He had omitted West from the letters because he had known, with the certainty of someone who had watched a particular pattern repeat for years, that if West knew the whole thing, he would step back again. He would find a reason it wasn't right. He would wait for a moment that was perfect and never arrive. So Stellan had set the stage without asking the man who was supposed to be standing on it. She did not know yet how to feel about that. It was a kind of love, she thought, the kind that overrode other people's objections for their own good, the kind that could be simultaneously generous and presumptuous. She had known her father to do the same thing. She had done it herself once or twice, and had not always been right. She put the letter in the drawer of the desk, not the locked one, her own drawer. In her own part of this room, she was slowly, cautiously making into something she lived in, rather than something she was waiting in. Then she went to make breakfast. West was already at the table when she came into the kitchen. He had coffee, and the look of a man who had been outside since before the light, and had a list of things in his head that he was working through in order. She had learned to read the particular quality of his mornings. Some days he was present in the kitchen in a way that allowed for conversation, and some days he was present in the way of someone who was already 3 fields over in his mind, and the difference was visible if you knew what to look for. This morning was somewhere between the two. She put eggs on and did not say anything about the letter. She was not ready. Not because she was afraid of the conversation, but because she wanted to understand more of the shape before she walked into it. "Vera stopped by yesterday," West said. He was looking at his cup. "I didn't see her," she said. "She came to the barn while you were with Clem." He paused. "She wanted to know if you'd opened the box." "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know." Margot turned back to the eggs. "She could have asked me." "She said she didn't want to rush you." Another pause. "She said Stellan would have said the same thing, that you'd open it when you were ready, and not before." Margot thought about this. She knew him well. Yes, West said. Just that. She brought the eggs to the table and sat down across from him. They ate in the companionable quiet that had, sometime in the past 3 weeks, replaced the careful quiet of the early days. The difference was small, but real. The earlier quiet had been about not disturbing something fragile, and this one was about something else entirely. About two people who had found that silence between them was not uncomfortable. She looked up and found him looking at her. He looked away. She looked down at her plate. Neither of them said anything. That afternoon, Price came back. He arrived with the particular purposefulness of a man who had thought carefully about his next move and was satisfied with it. He accepted coffee again. He sat in the chair he had sat in the first time, which she noticed because it was slightly away from the table, the chair of a man who preferred to observe from a small distance. He talked with West about ordinary matters she listened to with half her attention. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the situation." He did not specify which situation. He did not need to. The word landed in the kitchen with the weight of something that had been positioned carefully. "There's a man," Price said, "over toward the eastern settlement. Widower. Good man, steady, with a proper house and a working farm. I've mentioned your circumstances to him. He's open to a conversation." He said it to West. He was looking at West. Margot was sitting 6 feet away. She set down her cup. She did it gently, which required some effort. "Reverend," she said, "I'm here." Price looked at her with the patient benevolence of someone who had not intended to be rude and did not understand that he had been. "Of course," he said. "I simply thought it might be useful for West to—" "I'm sure it's useful," Margot said. "I'm also sure that any conversation about my circumstances should be had with me, since they are mine." A small silence. Price adjusted. He was, she could see, a man who was accustomed to adjusting, not because he was flexible exactly, but because he was practiced at maintaining a pleasant surface over his sense of how things ought to be. He turned to her with a look of generous attention. "Of course, I simply want to ensure you're settled properly. A woman alone in a situation like this benefits from being included in the conversation about her situation," Margot said pleasantly. "Yes, I agree." Another adjustment. "Edmund Farr is a good man," Price said. "I thought it might be worth a meeting, at least." "I'll keep it in mind," Margot said. He left. West walked him to his horse and came back alone. He stood in the kitchen doorway. The afternoon light was behind him. "He means well," West said. "I know that," Margot said. "Meaning well is not a defense." West looked at her. "What is?" "Being right," she said, "or being honest about not knowing." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong that the situation is complicated," she supplied. "I was going to say unusual." "Unusual, then." She looked at him directly. "Did he ask you about it before? Before today?" The pause before his answer was not quite long enough to be damning, but it was there. "He raised it," West said, "last week." "And what did you say?" He looked at the wall behind her. "I didn't say no." She stood up and took both cups to the counter and stood there with her back to him for a moment, not because she was angry. She was not, quite. But because she needed a moment to decide what she was going to do with the truth now that it had been said plainly. "I'm not going to wait," she said, "to find out whether you're going to stand in the road." She turned around. "I've been in enough situations that depended on someone else's decision. I'm not going to be in another one." West looked at her. Something in his face had shifted. Something that had been held carefully for a long time was, very slightly, less held. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I'll make my own decision," she said, "about Edmund Farr or anyone else. And I'll make it based on what I want, not on what someone else decides is convenient." She paused. "I wanted you to know that." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "All right. It's your decision," he said. "It should be." It was not the whole of what needed to be said between them, but it was a beginning. She nodded once. She went back to the table and sat down and opened the ledger she had been working on, because there was still an error in the larger account book that she had been sitting on for too long, and she was tired of sitting on things. "I need to show you something," she said. "In the other ledger, the ranch accounts." West crossed to the table and sat down across from her. She got the ledger from the shelf where he kept it and opened it to the page she had been looking at for 3 weeks. She turned it to face him and pointed, not to the total, that would be where he would look, but to the source, the quiet, systematic pattern of small discrepancies that added up to something larger. She watched him look at it. She watched the moment he saw it. It was a specific look, not surprise exactly, but the reconfiguration of a picture around a new piece of information. "How long?" he said. "From what I can see, at least a year, probably longer." "Who?" She told him what she had worked out from the pattern, the timing, the amounts, the specific accounts. She laid it out the way she laid out a diagnosis. "Here is what I see. Here is what it suggests. Here is what would need to be verified." She was careful to present it as evidence rather than conclusion, because she was aware she had only been here a month and he had been here his whole life, and the relationship between those two things mattered. West listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions when she finished, both precise, both about specific entries she had flagged. He sat back. "You found this in the first week," he said. "I found it in the first few days." "Why didn't you say anything?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I had no standing. I had been here for a week. You didn't know me. If I walked in and told you that someone in your ranch was skimming money, you would have had every reason to look at me and wonder why the stranger with no stake in anything was rearranging things before she was even sure she was staying." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And now?" "Now I've been here long enough to have some standing," she said, "and I'm tired of sitting on it." He almost smiled. "You always say that." "It's always true." That evening, they sat on the porch after supper. This had become a habit she had not noticed becoming a habit until it already was one. The way the most significant things happen, gradually and without announcement. The light was going out of the sky in layers, amber to rose to a deep, clear blue at the zenith. West had brought his coffee. She had brought her book, though she had not opened it. They were quiet for a time. The land settled into its evening vocabulary. The insects, the distant cattle, the hawk that made its final pass before dark. She had learned this vocabulary now. She knew which sounds were ordinary and which were not. "He wrote about you," she said. West looked at her. "Stellan," she said. "He was writing a letter. He didn't finish it. Vera had it in the box." She paused. "He was going to tell me about you. He said the ranch would be nothing without the backbone of it, and the backbone was you." West looked away. The muscle in his jaw moved. "He also said he hadn't told you he was writing to me," she said. "Not the whole of it." No, West said. He didn't. Did you know at all? A pause. I knew he was thinking about it. He mentioned it once, months before. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. I told him it wasn't a good idea. Why? He looked at her with an expression she was only now learning to read, not closed, but careful. The look of a man who had a great deal to say and had organized it over years into a very small public space. Because I didn't think I was the reason to bring someone here, he said. That's not something you do. You don't bring a person into something as hard as this without being sure. Sure of what? The question sat between them. The last of the light was going. He looked at the ridgeline where the amber was deepening into something darker, and she looked at the side of his face, and the silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Sure that you have something to offer, he said finally. That's worth what it costs them. Margot was quiet for a moment. She looked at the same ridgeline. My father said something like that once, she said. He had a patient who needed surgery. The surgery was difficult and the odds weren't good, but without it, the odds were worse. He spent a week deciding whether to do it. What did he decide? He did the surgery. The patient lived. She paused. I asked him afterward how he had decided. He said, the cost of doing nothing is also a cost. You just don't always get the bill at the same time. West was still. The coffee cup was still in his hands, forgotten. He called to you first, she said quietly. After 3 years, he called your name first. I think he had already decided something. I think he was trying to tell you. A long silence. The evening had gone fully dark now, and the stars were beginning, cautious at first and then all at once. I know, West said, very low. I've thought about that every day since. She did not tell him it was all right. She did not tell him Stellan had forgiven him, because she did not know that. And she was not in the habit of offering comfort she couldn't verify. She sat with him in the dark and let the stars come out and did not try to fix the thing that was not hers to fix. After a while, he said, What was in the box, besides the letter? A river stone, she said, and a piece of ribbon. He was quiet for a moment. The ribbon was from the first letter they wrote to each other. Vera told me that once. She had tied it around it, before she sent it. He kept it. He paused. He kept everything. I know, Margot said. He kept mine too. West looked at her. She looked back. He was trying to make something possible, she said quietly, that you wouldn't make possible for yourself. West held her gaze for a long moment. You don't know that, he said. But he said it the way people say things they already believe, but are not ready to fully claim. I know enough, she said. I'm a quick study. He made a sound then, low and almost involuntary, that was closer to a laugh than anything she had heard from him yet. It was brief and quiet, and it disappeared almost before it was there. But she heard it. She filed it away with the other things that mattered and did not announce themselves. The stars were fully out now. The land below them was dark and enormous and still. There's going to be a conversation, she said, about the ledger, about Price, about Edmund Farr. She paused. About what happens next. I know, he said. Are you ready for it? He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything that deserved consideration. Not entirely, he said. All right, she said. Neither am I. They sat with that for a while, the honest admission of two people who were not ready and were going to have the conversation anyway, because that was the only way anything difficult ever happened. The wind came up late, moving through the grass in long waves she could hear without seeing. The house creaked once, settling. From somewhere in the barn, the dark bay horse, Stellan's horse, the one that had finally, one morning, allowed West near, made a low sound that could have been contentment, or simply the noise a living thing makes in the dark to remind itself it is still there. She was not waiting anymore. She was beginning. Later, much later, after the stars had moved and the coyotes had finished their distant conversation, she lay in the dark of her room and thought about the way people show you who they are before they know they're doing it. Her father had taught her that. Not in so many words, but by example, by the way he watched people in the clinic waiting room before he went in to see them. You learn more in the first 5 minutes than in the next 5 hours, he had said once. And she had thought she understood him, but she understood him better now, sitting with the knowledge of what she had learned about West Hale without him having told her most of it directly. He had shown her by how he treated the horses. He had shown her by the way he ate what she cooked, without ever pretending it was something other than what it was. Sometimes good, sometimes only adequate. And said thank you each time with the same level of sincerity. He had shown her by the way he listened, which was the rarest thing she had encountered in a person. He listened without preparing his next sentence. He simply received what was said and sat with it, and then responded to what had actually been said, rather than what he had been waiting to respond to. She thought about the morning with the herbs. She thought about the way he had looked at the bundle above the window and said nothing, and how saying nothing had, in that moment, said everything. She was beginning, she thought, to learn his language. The question was what she intended to do with that. The conversation about the ledger happened on a Thursday. West had spent 2 days with it. She had given him the time, as she had said she would, without pressing. And on Thursday morning, he came into the kitchen while she was still at the table with her coffee and her botanical reference. And he set the ledger down between them and sat across from her and said, "Tell me again, from the beginning." So she did. She walked him through it the way she walked through anything complex, not rushing toward the conclusion but building it, layer by layer, so that by the time they arrived at the answer it felt inevitable rather than surprising. She showed him the pattern, the timing of the discrepancies, which always fell in the weeks following a significant purchase or a difficult weather event, when the accounts were most active and the individual entries easiest to obscure. She showed him where the 2 different handwriting styles diverged in the secondary ledger and how the looser hand appeared only on certain entries and how those entries all shared particular characteristics. West listened the way he always listened, without interruption, without the restless energy of someone waiting for his turn to speak. He asked 4 questions, each one precise, each one suggesting that he had been thinking about this for 2 days and had arrived at his own partial conclusions and wanted to verify them against hers. "It's Denny," he said, when she had finished. She had suspected as much. Denny was the man who kept the secondary records, younger than Harlan, older than Clem, present on the ranch for 4 years. Quiet in the particular way of people who have learned that quietness is useful cover. She had watched him for 3 weeks and had found nothing dramatic in his behavior, nothing that announced itself, only the numbers. "I think so," she said. "I can't be certain, but the pattern is his," West said. He was not angry. He was something quieter than anger, something that looked from the outside like stillness, but had a different quality to it. The stillness of a man absorbing a specific kind of disappointment, the kind that arrives not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something he had refused to look at directly. "How long have you known?" she asked. He looked at the ledger. "I didn't know, but I had—" He paused. There were things that didn't add up. I told myself it was my accounting. Numbers have never been what I'm good at. "You're better than you think," she said. "You saw the totals were wrong. You just didn't know where to look for the source." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly, but the specific acknowledgement of someone who had been given information that required him to think differently about himself, which was not always a comfortable thing, even when it was a useful one. "What do you do with it?" she asked. She meant the question genuinely. This was his ranch, his accounting, his man. It was not her decision to make, and she was not going to make it. West was quiet for a long moment. "Talk to him," he said. "First." She nodded. "That's right." "You think so?" "I think you know this person. I don't. That matters." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Handing things back to me." She considered this. "Because they're yours," she said. "I can tell you what the numbers say. I can't tell you what they mean for how you run this place. That's different." He was quiet. Then he stood and picked up the ledger. "I'll talk to him today," he said. "Do you want me to—" "No," he said, not unkindly. "This one's mine." She stayed in the house. She worked on the domestic ledger, reorganized the herb shelf, checked on Clem, who was back to full work but had developed a habit of stopping by the kitchen at odd hours that she suspected had less to do with hunger than with the simple pleasure of having somewhere comfortable to stop. She let him have it. Everyone needed somewhere comfortable to stop. She did not watch from the window when West walked to the far side of the yard where Denny was working. She had said her part. She went back to her herbs. It was an hour before West came back inside. She looked up from the table. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the counter and poured water and drank it and set the glass down and stood there with his hands flat on the counter, looking at nothing. She waited. "He has a daughter," West said. "Back east. Her mother died 2 winters ago. He's been sending money. What he could make here wasn't enough." He paused. "He's been doing it for 14 months. Margot was quiet. "He didn't try to explain it as anything but what it was," West said. "He just told me." He turned around. He looked genuinely tired in the deep way that had nothing to do with sleep. He said he'd been expecting me to find out for a long time. He said he was almost relieved. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "He has to go," West said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that. "I can't. If I let it stand, then the accounts mean nothing. Then anything can be anything." He paused. "But I'm going to give him a month's wages and a reference. He's not a bad man. He was in an impossible position, and he made a wrong choice. And those aren't the same thing as being bad." Margot looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "They're not." He held her gaze. Something passed between them that neither of them named. A recognition, perhaps, that they had both made choices in impossible positions, and that the question of whether those choices were wrong was not always simple. "Thank you," he said, "for the ledger, for waiting until you could say it." "Thank you," she said, "for listening." He almost smiled. He picked up his hat and went back outside. She sat at the table for a while after he left and thought about impossible positions and wrong choices and the difference between them. She was still thinking about this when she heard the rider come into the yard. Not West. She knew his horse's rhythm now. The particular cadence of a well-matched pair that had been working together long enough to move like one thing. This was a different horse, coming faster than someone arriving in courtesy. She went to the window. The rider was a young man she had seen twice before. One of the hands from the Aldrich property, 2 miles east. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he was looking toward the barn with the focused urgency of someone who had ridden hard and needed to keep moving. She was already at the door. "Where's Mr. Hale?" the young man said. "Barn," she said. "What happened?" "Accident at the Aldrich place. The youngest boy. He fell from the grain loft. Mrs. Aldrich said to get the doctor from town, but it's 4 miles further and—" "How long ago did he fall?" Margot said. The young man blinked. He was not accustomed to being asked medical questions by women in doorways. "Maybe an hour. He's conscious, but—" She was already going back inside for her kit. She had kept it packed since she arrived, on the shelf by the door, because that was how her father had kept his, and the habit had moved into her without discussion. She had it in her hand in 30 seconds. "Take me there," she said. "Now." They were on horses inside 2 minutes. She had saddled the smaller roan herself, faster than the young man expected. She did not stop to find West. There was not time to find West. She left a note on the kitchen table. "Aldrich boy. Grain loft fall. Back when I can." She rode. The Aldrich property was smaller than the Hale Ranch, the house lower, the yard more cluttered with the productive disorder of a family with many children and not enough hours. Mrs. Aldrich met her at the door, a woman of perhaps 50, solid and pale with a specific pallor of controlled fear, and took her directly upstairs without preamble, which Margot appreciated. The boy was 8 years old and had fallen approximately 12 feet onto a packed dirt floor. He was conscious and frightened and had the particular shallow breathing of someone in significant pain, which was both concerning and, in its way, reassuring. Unconscious was worse. She examined him with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in difficult circumstances before, in clinic rooms with inadequate light and in farmhouses with inadequate equipment, and she assessed what she had to work with. The arm was broken, cleanly, which was luck. The ribs on the left side needed careful evaluation. The head was the thing she was most concerned about, and she spent 20 minutes on it, asking him questions that seemed strange but were not, watching his eyes, testing his responses, before she allowed herself to form a working conclusion. He was going to be all right. Not without pain, not without weeks of careful management, but the fundamental injury was survivable and treatable with what she had. She told Mrs. Aldrich this in plain terms, watching the woman's shoulders drop 2 inches as the information arrived. She set the arm. She bound the ribs. She gave instructions, precise, written down in her careful hand on a piece of paper from her kit, for the next several days, for what to watch for when to be concerned. She stayed for another hour to be sure the boy had settled and the family understood what they were managing. When she came downstairs, West was in the front room. She stopped. He was standing near the door with his hat in his hand, and he had the look of a man who had arrived somewhere at speed and was now making himself be still. He looked at her face for a long moment before he said anything, reading it the way she read faces, quickly and thoroughly. "He's all right," she said. West exhaled. Just once, quietly, but she heard it. Your note said grain loft, he said. 12 feet. Clean break in the arm, bruised ribs, no serious injury to the head. She paused. He was lucky. You were fast. I'm always fast, she said. It's not a choice. They rode back together in the evening light. The horses moved at a comfortable pace, unhurried, and the land around them went amber and rose in the long horizontal way of evenings out here, the light coming in low and clear and touching everything evenly. She was tired, not the sharp fatigue of a bad night, but the deeper tiredness of someone who had given a great deal of concentration in a short time and was now, with the urgency past, feeling the weight of it. West rode close enough that she was aware of him beside her. He did not speak for a while. She did not need him to. Then he said, "You didn't wait for me." "There wasn't time." "I know." A pause. That's not a complaint." It sounded like one. It wasn't. He looked ahead. "I was going to say I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you went." He paused. "I've spent a lot of time waiting for the right moment to do things. You don't." She looked at him. "I've spent enough time watching wrong moments become the only moment," she said. "You stop waiting. Up." He held her gaze for a moment before looking back at the road. "Yes," he said. "I think you do." They arrived back at the ranch as the last light was going. She saw to the horse, and he saw to his, and they worked in the same barn at the same task with the comfortable parallel efficiency that had developed between them over weeks of proximity, and when they came out, the stars were beginning. She was at the porch step when he said her name, not Miss Vane, not any of the careful circumventions he had used for the first weeks. Her name, just that. She turned. He was standing in the yard, a few feet from the step, with his hat in his hands. She had noticed early on that he held his hat when he was thinking hard about something. He was holding it now, and he was not turning it. "Price is coming tomorrow," he said, with Farr. She had expected this. "I know," she said. "I didn't invite them," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" It was the first time he had asked her that. Not what should be done, or what would you like, or any of the softened versions of the question. What do you want to do? As if her wanting was the primary information. She sat down on the porch step. "I want to meet Edmund Farr," she said. "I want to meet him properly, as a person, not as a solution to a problem someone else identified." West nodded slowly. "And then I want to make my own decision," she said, "without anyone's help." "All right," he said. She looked at him. "That's all? What else should I say?" "Most people," she said carefully, "would have an opinion." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were still on the hat. "I have one," he said. She waited. He looked at the hat. He looked at the ridgeline behind her. He looked at her. "I told Price no," he said. "This afternoon, when he sent word about tomorrow. I told him the decision was yours, and that I had no right to make it for you or against you." He paused. "But then I called the rider back, and I told him to come anyway." She was very still. "Why?" "Because I've spent 3 years stepping back from things that mattered," he said. "And it didn't work out the way I thought stepping back was supposed to work out." He held her gaze. "I thought you should meet him, and I thought I should be there when you do. Not to influence it, just to be in the road this time, instead of out of the way." The night was fully dark now. The stars were the kind of bright that only happened out here, away from everything, and the land below them was invisible and vast and present. She looked at him for a long time. She was reading him the way she read things that mattered, carefully, completely, without rushing to the conclusion. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow, then." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He looked like a man who had said something difficult and was not entirely sure yet whether it had been right, but had said it anyway. She understood that feeling. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment, not turning on the lamp, just standing in the familiar space of the house she had learned room by room, sound by sound, the way you learn a place you are beginning to think of as yours. She was afraid. She recognized it clearly, without drama, the way she recognized symptoms, the particular quality of alertness that preceded something significant, the awareness that tomorrow was a door and she did not know what was on the other side, and she was going to walk through it regardless. She was afraid, and she was also something else, something that sat alongside the fear without displacing it. She was ready. She went to Stellan's room. Her room now, she was thinking of it that way more and more, and sat at the desk. She looked at the locked drawer. She looked at the unfinished letter in her own drawer. She thought about what Stellan had been trying to make possible, and what West had done this evening by calling the writer back, and what it had cost him to do it. She sat for a while longer, then she took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not a letter, just notes, the kind she made when she was thinking something through and needed to see it in her own hand. She wrote for a while. Then she stopped and looked at what she had written and folded it and put it in the drawer. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. Down the hall, she heard West settle into his room. She heard the creak of the window, the one that faced west. She heard him, for the first time since she had arrived, not lie awake into the deep hours. She heard him, sometime around the middle of the night, go quiet in the way of actual sleep. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was a door. She was going to walk through it, and she was going to do it with her eyes open, and whatever was on the other side, she was going to meet it as herself. Not as a woman in a position, not as a solution to a problem, not as the person who had come with the wrong stage to the wrong man. As herself, Margot Vane, who had never once been allowed to simply be what she was and have that be enough. She was going to find out if it was enough. The house was quiet around her. The land beyond the window was dark and enormous and still. She slept. She had been in the barn once before in the dark, the night she had tended Clem. But that night had been urgent, purposeful. This was different. This was the barn at rest, the horses quiet in their stalls, the air thick with the particular warmth of living things at the end of a day. West had lit a single lantern and hung it on the post near the center, and it threw long shadows up the walls and made the space feel smaller and warmer than it was in daylight. He was checking on the dark bay when she came in. Not because the horse needed checking, she could see that from the doorway, but because it was the thing he did when he needed somewhere to be that wasn't the house. She had learned this. She stood in the doorway and watched him run his hand along the horse's flank in the unhurried way of someone who is not doing a task so much as keeping a kind of company. "I didn't hear you come in," he said. He had his back to her. "I know," she said. He turned then. The lantern light caught the side of his face, the tiredness around his eyes that she recognized as the particular fatigue of a long day that had asked more than usual. He had ridden hard to reach her at the Aldrich place. She had not fully considered until this moment what that meant, that he had read her note and not hesitated, had simply come. "The boy," he said, "will be fine. I told you. I know you told me." He paused. "I wanted to hear it again." She looked at him. She thought about what Stellan had written in his unfinished letter. The backbone of this place, the thing that makes it hold when everything else is difficult. She thought about a man who had been holding things together alone for years, quietly and without acknowledgement, and who had ridden hard through the evening to find her, not because the situation required it, but because he had not been able to stay behind. "He'll be back to arguing with his brothers by the end of the week," she said. West almost smiled. "That's a good sign, I take it." "The best." She came further into the barn. The dark bay turned its head to look at her, and she held out her hand the way she had learned worked, slowly, at a level, not reaching. The horse considered it, and then, with the grave dignity of an animal making a decision, moved its nose toward her palm. "He does that for you," West said. He sounded faintly surprised. "He's been doing it for a week," she said. She felt West look at her. She kept her attention on the horse. "I named him after Stellan," West said. "When Stellan bought him, he was so proud of that horse, wouldn't let anyone near him for the first month." A pause. "Some things take time to trust." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "They do." The lantern swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows shifted on the walls. Somewhere outside, a nighthawk called, that odd mechanical sound, and was answered by silence. "Tomorrow is going to be what it's going to be," she said finally. "But tonight was all right." She looked at him. "That's something." "Yes," he said. "Just that." But the way he said it was the way he said things that mattered. She went inside. He stayed a little longer with the horses, as he always did. She heard the barn door a few minutes later, and then his boots on the porch, and then the house settling itself around the familiar weight of him moving through it. Tomorrow was a door. But tonight, for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing in front of it alone. Edmund Farr arrived at mid-morning on a gray horse with a quiet manner, which she noted because the horses people chose and the way they handled them told her things that introductions rarely did. He was perhaps 50, with a steady face and the kind of eyes that had looked at hard weather long enough to stop being surprised by it. He was not nervous. He was not performative. He took off his hat when he came into the yard and held it the way West held his. Not fidgeting, just holding it. The gesture of a man who had somewhere to put his hands and knew it. Price was with him. Price had the satisfied look of a man whose plan was proceeding according to its intended shape, which Margot noted and set aside. West came out of the barn when he heard them arrive. He stood at the edge of the yard, not welcoming, not unwelcoming, simply present, the way he was present in most things, without performance, without excess. Margot came to the door. Farr looked at her the way she looked at things she wanted to understand, directly, without pretense. He said her name when Price introduced her, and he said it as a name, not as a category. "Miss Vane," he said, "I appreciate you being willing to meet." "I appreciate you coming," she said, and she meant it. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she had decided the night before that she was going to meet Edmund Farr as a person and extend to him the basic courtesy that his willingness to make this ride deserved. Whatever she decided after, she could decide after. She brought them inside. She made coffee. Price sat in his chair, the observer's chair, slightly away from the table. And West stood near the window in the way of a man who has decided to stay in the room but does not want to take up more space than necessary. She and Farr sat across from each other and talked. It was a real conversation. That was the thing she had not expected, or had expected to expect, and then been wrong about. He was not auditioning. He was not performing eligibility. He asked about her work, about what she had done before she came here, and when she told him about the clinic and the years beside her father and the particular satisfaction of knowing what was wrong and knowing how to address it, he listened with the specific attention of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting, rather than merely the required subject of a required conversation. He talked about his own place, the farm, the work, the quietness of it since his wife had died. He talked about it plainly, without self-pity, and without the aggressive cheerfulness of someone papering over a difficult thing. He said, "It's a good life. It's been a lonely one these past 2 years. I won't pretend otherwise." She liked him. She sat across from Edmund Farr and genuinely liked him, which had not been the outcome she had prepared for, and which required her to hold two things at once, her liking of him and her clarity about what she was going to say, without letting one displace the other. The conversation went on for a while. At some point she was aware that West had moved from the window to the chair at the far end of the table, not intrusively, just present. She did not look at him. She kept her attention on Farr because he deserved that, and because she was a woman who finished what she started. When there was a natural pause, she said, "I want to be honest with you." Farr looked at her. He had the face of a man who had decided at some point in his life that honesty was the only economy that reliably worked. "I think you're a good man," she said. "I think you came here genuinely, and I think Reverend Price's intentions, whatever I might think of his methods, are not unkind." She paused. "And I have to tell you that I can't accept what's being offered. Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it's not where I am." Farr looked at her for a long moment. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had known, somewhere in the preceding hour, that this was the shape of things, and had been deciding how to receive it. "Where are you?" he asked, quietly, without accusation. She held his gaze. She did not look at West. "Here," she said. "I'm here." Farr nodded slowly. He looked down at the table for a moment, and then back up. "I can respect that," he said. He said it the way people say things they mean, simply, without architecture. He finished his coffee. He stood and put his hat back on. He looked at West, who was still at the end of the table, and something passed between them, a look that had the quality of two men who understand the same thing about difficulty and are not going to make it harder than it already is. "Good luck to you," Farr said. He said it to both of them. Price left too, though with less grace than Farr, not rudely, but with the contained displeasure of a man whose plan had arrived at the wrong destination through no error of logic he could identify. She let him go without argument. He had meant well. Meaning well and being right were different things, and she had said as much before, and did not need to say it again. Then the yard was empty and the house was quiet, and it was only the two of them and the particular quality of a morning that had held its breath and was now, slowly, exhaling. West was still at the table. She sat back down across from him. She did not say anything for a moment, and he did not either. And the silence between them was the good kind, Not the silence of things left unsaid, but the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are taking a moment to notice that they're there. You liked him, West said. Yes, she said. He's a good man. You said that to him. It was true. West turned his cup in his hands, the thinking gesture, the one she had catalogued weeks ago. Most people wouldn't say a thing like that, he said, in that situation. Most people use kindness as an excuse to be imprecise, she said. I don't think that's actually kind. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. I called the writer back, he said. Yesterday. I know, she said. You told me. I want to tell you what it meant, he said, when I did it. He paused. He was doing the careful thing, the thing of finding the right words without rushing toward wrong ones. I've spent a long time telling myself that stepping aside was the generous thing, that not asking for things was a kind of integrity. He paused. Stellan tried to tell me it wasn't. He tried to tell me that for years, probably. I wasn't listening. She was very still. The morning he died, West said, I think he was going to tell me about the letters. I think that was what he had been working up to. I think he had decided, if I wouldn't do it myself, he was going to do it for me. And he was going to make me be angry about it so that at least I'd be feeling something. He looked at the table. That sounds like him. It did, she thought. It sounded exactly like him. I'm not stepping aside this time, West said. He looked up. His eyes were clear and direct, and had in them the specific quality of a man who has made a decision and is on the other side of making it. I'm not going to pretend I know how any of this is supposed to go. I've never... He stopped. I don't have a lot of practice at this, at saying the thing instead of going around it. He paused. But I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs someone, not because the ledger needs keeping, not because Stellan arranged it. He held her gaze. Because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I do is listen for you in the kitchen. Because the house sounds different than it used to. Because I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks what the right word is for what you are to this place. And the only honest answer I have is that you're not a word about the place at all. The morning light came through the window in the particular amber way she had come to love. The kitchen held its breath. Margot looked at him for a long moment. She read him the way she read everything that mattered, completely, without hurrying. I'm going to ask you something, she said. He waited. Not Stellan's question, she said. Mine. She paused. Do you want to marry me? West looked at her. His hands on the cup were still. Something in his face had the quality of something released. Not collapsed, not overcome, just released. The way a thing that has been held under tension for a long time finally finds the position it was meant to be in. Yes, he said, simply, without architecture. She nodded once. Then I'll stay, she said. They were married on a morning in early spring when the grass had come back green along the south pasture, and the air had the particular clarity that followed the last of the cold. 2 people from the ranch stood as witnesses. Vera came, not because anyone had specifically asked her, though West had sent word, which was enough, but because she understood, as she always had understood, the things that mattered, that this was something Stellan had begun, and that witnessing it was a way of completing a circle she had been part of from the start. She stood at the edge of the small gathering with a straight back and a genuine expression, and she looked at Margot with the recognition that had been in her eyes from the first visit. The recognition, Margot now understood, of someone who had always known this was where things were heading, even when no one else did. The words were said in the front room of the house, in the morning light, with the windows open because the air was good and there was no reason to keep it out. Margot wore the better of her two dresses. West wore his good coat and had done something specific and careful with his hair that she found, without meaning to, completely endearing. When it was done, he took her hand. He did it without looking at their hands. He looked at her face, as if the important thing was not the gesture, but what she thought of it. She held his hand back and thought, "This is what it feels like to be chosen. Not managed, not arranged, not solved. Chosen by a specific person who had looked at the full shape of her, difficult and direct and not going to become quieter or easier, and said yes. This one, this is the one I want to keep." She had not known until this moment how much she had needed that. 2 weeks later, she found the horse had been given a new name. She discovered it the way she discovered most things on this ranch, not because anyone told her, but because she was paying attention. She had gone to the barn in the early morning, before West was back from the south fence, and she had seen it on the small wooden tag on the dark baize stall. Stellan's horse, the one that had taken a month to let anyone near. The one who had finally come to West when West stopped trying. The name on the tag was Margot. She stood in front of the stall for a long time. The horse looked at her with its large dark eyes and did not move away. She reached out her hand, slowly, and held it at the edge of the stall. The horse considered this. Then it stepped forward and placed its nose against her palm with the warm, deliberate weight of something that has decided to trust. She stood there until she heard West's horse in the yard. She took her hand back and straightened and went to the barn door. He came in leading his horse, and he saw her standing there, and he paused. She looked at him. She looked back at the stall. She looked at him again. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. The almost smile she had been cataloging since the second week. The one that showed up more often now. The one that was becoming, gradually and without announcement, simply the way his face looked when he was somewhere he wanted to be. She went inside to make coffee. She made enough for 2 cups. She set them both on the table. She sat down and opened her botanical reference to the page she had been working on, a new section she was adding with the plants specific to this region, plants she had learned from walking the property and from asking Harlan and from simple observation, which was still, after everything, her most reliable method. She heard West come in. She heard him take off his boots at the door. She heard the familiar weight of his footstep on the board she had long since learned by sound. He sat down across from her. He picked up his cup. Outside, the land stretched out in every direction under a sky that went all the way to the edge of things. The grass was coming in along the south pasture, green and thick, and the horses had spread out across it with the ease of animals that had made it through something difficult and were now, simply, here. Margot made a note in the margin of her reference. West drank his coffee. The house was not too quiet anymore. It had not been too quiet for some time. She had stopped being able to remember precisely when that had changed. Only that it had. The way the most important changes happen, gradually and then completely, and then in a way that made the before difficult to reconstruct. She was here. She had chosen it, and it had chosen her. And the difference between those two things had turned out to be smaller than she had expected, which was, she thought, exactly as it should be. The morning continued. The coffee went warm and then cool. The land outside did what land does when no one is asking anything of it. It simply was, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, consequential, ordinary life being built inside the house at its edge. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. That spring she planted a garden, not the kitchen garden that was already there, the practical and orderly rows of herbs and vegetables that she tended because they were useful. Something different, something she had not planned but found herself doing one morning in late spring when she walked past the east side of the house and noticed a patch of ground that got good light from mid-morning until late afternoon and was doing nothing in particular with it. She planted flowers. She had seeds in the bottom of her kit. She had carried them for years, her mother's seeds, moved from house to house, and never planted because there had never been a place she was sure she was going to stay. She had not thought about them consciously when she packed in the spring. She had simply packed them the way she packed the botanical reference and the spare lancet and the small tin of her father's best salve. The things you carry because you carry them without asking yourself why. She worked the ground herself, spending 2 mornings at it before she was satisfied. She planted in the afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with the sun warm on her back, pressing seeds into the earth one by one with the same focused attention she brought to everything she considered worth doing. West found her at it the second afternoon. He stood at the corner of the house for a while, watching, and she was aware of him, but did not turn around. When she had finished the last row, she sat back on her heels, and he came over and stood beside her and looked at the turned earth. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Larkspur," she said. "Sweet William. A few things my mother grew." He was quiet for a moment. "She'll like the light here," he said. "In the afternoon." She looked up at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her. She understood he was not talking about her mother, exactly. Or not only about her mother. He was talking about what it meant that she had planted something, that she had put her mother's seeds into the ground of this particular place. "Yes," she said. "I think she will." He put his hand down to help her up. She took it. They stood for a moment looking at the garden together, this small, deliberate patch of earth that was neither practical nor necessary and was exactly right. In the weeks that followed, she found herself doing something she had not done in a very long time. She found herself not thinking about what came next. This was unusual enough that she noticed it. The absence of the forward-looking anxiety that had been her companion for as long as she could remember. The constant inventory of what she had and what she didn't have, what was secure and what was precarious. It had been with her since her mother died, and she had understood for the first time that stability was not a given. It had been with her through the years beside her father, and through her father's illness, and through the long, uncertain months after. It was not with her anymore, or not in the same way. She still made assessments. She was not a different person, but she was making them about the present rather than about the future. And the future, for the first time in as long as she could recall, felt less like something to be managed and more like something to move toward. She thought sometimes about Stellan, not with grief. She had grieved in her way for the life she had imagined and not found, and that grieving had been completed before the spring. She thought about him with a kind of complicated gratitude. He had been building something, with those careful letters and that deliberate omission and that unfinished note. He had been building it without asking permission, which was presumptuous, And he had been building it out of love, which was something else. She thought that if she had met him, she would have found him exasperating and difficult to stay angry at, which was probably exactly the kind of person he had been. She thought sometimes about her father, about the surgery he had almost not done, the patient he had almost not reached toward, about the cost of doing nothing, and how the bill arrived differently depending on which choice you made, but arrived either way. She had made her choices. They were hers. That was, she thought, the most important part. One evening in late spring, she was in the kitchen when she heard West come in from the south pasture and do what he always did. Boots off at the door, hat on the peg, brief pause in the hallway that she had come to understand was him listening to the house, making sure everything was as it should be. Then his footstep, familiar now as her own heartbeat, moving toward the kitchen. He came in and looked at her and said nothing. And she looked at him and said nothing. And he went to the basin and washed his hands and sat down at the table. And she brought the plates over and sat across from him. And they ate their supper in the easy quiet that had become the sound of their evenings. And it was... She thought about the words she would use if she had to. If someone asked her how she would describe it. It was what she had been looking for. Without knowing, she was looking for it. Not a specific thing. Just this. A particular quality of ordinary life that felt, finally, like hers. Outside, the larkspur was coming in. She had checked it that morning. Small green shoots pushing up through the turned earth, each one finding its way toward the light with a single-minded purpose of living things that know what they need. It would be blue when it bloomed, a deep, clear blue that her mother had said reminded her of the sky just before the last light went. Margot had not seen it bloom yet. She would, in time. That was the thing about staying. You got to see things bloom.